Malaysian 370 standby and Malaysian 6 is cleared to Frankfurt via Agosa Alpha departure, 6,000 feet squawk 2106. Malaysian 370, request level.
370, we are ready, requesting flight level 350 to Beijing.
Malaysian 370 is cleared to Beijing via Pibos Alpha departure, 6,000 feet squawk 2157.
Beijing, people Sanfang 6000, squawk 2157, Malaysian 370, thank you.
Malaysian 370, welcome, over to ground.
Good day, sir. Malaysian 370, good morning, 21, requesting push and start. 340 ground, morning, push back and start, push runway 3 to right, exit via Sierra 4. Push back, start, push it right, exit Sierra 4, PRP 239, Mike Romeo Oscar. Copy. 670 tower. On 188 on Malaysian 370. 370, 3 to right of takeoff. Nice. 3 to right of takeoff, Malaysian 37. Thank you, bye. Malaysian 370. Control Malaysian 370.
Malaysian 370, number radar, good morning, climb flight number 250.
Morning, level 250, Malaysian 370.
Malaysian 370, contact Ho Chi Minh 120.9, good night.
Good night, Malaysian 370.
That would be the last transmission received from Flight 370. At 6:30 that morning, the aircraft would not arrive at its scheduled time at Beijing Capital International Airport. Within 2 minutes of Flight 370 missing its scheduled arrival, the Kuala Lumpur Aeronautical Rescue Coordination Center was activated. At 7:13 a.m., a ground aircraft telephone call was placed by Malaysia Airlines via the aircraft satellite link. That call goes unanswered. But the fact that the phone rang indicates the aircraft hadn't crashed. 11 minutes later, Malaysia Airlines announces to the world that Flight 370 is missing.
The Malaysia Airlines flight with 239 people on board, including 4 Americans, has gone missing.
What the world didn't know at that time was that there had been non-stop attempts to contact and track the aircraft since its last transmission at 1:19 a.m. But none of these attempts were successful. So, what actually happened to Flight 370? To be honest, we don't know. Even today, we still don't know exactly what happened. While it's not totally out of the question for smaller aircraft in remote places of the world to go missing, aircraft of this size don't just go missing. Trying to piece together a narrative of what happened to Flight 370 is extremely complicated. Examining the facts of what we do know can give us some idea of what happened. But even after we know what happened, that still doesn't answer why it happened. First, let's take a look at what actually happened on that fateful night. At 12:42 a.m. on March 8, 2014, Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 departed Kuala Lumpur International Airport. The back and forth chatter between the captain and air traffic control seemed routine as the flight ascended to 35,000 feet. The final transmission between Kuala Lumpur and Flight 370 was this.
Malaysian 370, contact Ho Chi Minh 120.9. Good night.
Good night, Malaysian 370.
2 minutes after its last transmission, the position symbol of Flight 370 disappears from KL-ACC radar. Now, this would only happen if the aircraft's transponder was no longer functioning. At 1:25 a.m., the flight began to deviate from its planned route to Beijing, but this wasn't entirely known while it was happening because of how aircraft are tracked by air traffic controllers. Planes are all supposed to carry a transponder with them on board. This transponder is technically what air traffic control tracks. If you remember the movie Con Air, there was a scene where one of the characters replaces their transponder with that of another plane. Of all the things in that movie, that bit was probably the most realistic.
Don't they have a way of tracking these planes?
Oh yeah, it's called a transponder. Every plane's got one, Sandino.
Swamp, where is the transponder?
Where indeed?
Are you sure it's safe to fly in this?
No problem, I've done this 1,000 times. We'll be through this in a few minutes. You all right back there, ladies?
At 2:22 a.m., Flight 370 disappeared from Malaysian radar, or at least the transponder signal did. The aircraft was still being tracked by other means. By this point, Flight 370 had already entered Cambodian airspace. Kuala Lumpur realized this and began contacting Cambodian air traffic control, asking if they had any knowledge of Flight 370. Kuala Lumpur then contacted Malaysia Airlines about the situation. Malaysia Airlines said they were able to exchange signals with Flight 370 and confirmed it was, in fact, in Cambodian airspace. It was at this point at 2:22 that the last primary radar contact was made, and it was picked up by the Malaysian military. 3 minutes later at 2:25, the aircraft itself sent a logon request, probably by the computer itself, via its satellite communications link to the Inmarsat Satellite Communications Network. At 2:35, the Malaysia Airlines Operations Center confirms the flight's location based on its signals near northern Vietnam. A few minutes later at 2:39, a ground-to-aircraft telephone call was attempted via the aircraft's satellite link, but it goes unanswered. It wasn't until nearly an hour after that failed telephone call attempt that Malaysia Airlines realized they had been following the flight location based on the flight's projection and not the transponder, which had been turned off. Flight 370 was not where they thought it was. For whatever reason, most of the computer systems on board had been disabled or shut down. But one of the only computer systems still in operation, however, was this automated hourly handshake the aircraft made with itself and the Inmarsat Communications Satellite Network. And in the end, it was these simple, brief electronic exchanges that allowed officials to actually track, in retrospect, Flight 370's actual path. These automated handshakes successfully occurred at 3:41, 4:41, 5:41, and 6:41. Measuring how long it took for the signal to ping back to the satellite actually gave officials a theoretical location each time the hourly handshakes occurred. And until recently, it was the only way they were able to get any sense of the aircraft's actual location. But more on that part of the investigation later. At 7:13, another ground aircraft telephone call was attempted. It rang, but no one answered. At this point, this was still good news because the fact that it rang meant the flight was still in the air. At 8:11, the final handshake was recorded. A few minutes later at 8:19, the aircraft sent a logon request to the same satellite. This is often referred to as a partial handshake and usually occurs due to a power failure with the aircraft itself. What triggers this logon attempt is the aircraft's emergency power generator kicking in. A few seconds after receiving a response from the ground station, the aircraft's computer acknowledges the reply. This is the final communication made by Flight 370. By this point, efforts had already been underway to try and locate the missing flight, but a lot of miscommunication with the various air traffic controllers only caused more confusion. With a missing aircraft carrying as many people as it was, a lot of media attention was focused on lots of different aspects early on. In fact, the satellite communications I just referenced were not even discovered until the following day. For a while, authorities were looking in the wrong area, but nobody knew that at the time. It wasn't until March 10th that authorities acknowledged that the flight actually changed direction shortly after takeoff, and it wouldn't be until March 12th that Malaysian officials acknowledged that an unidentified aircraft had been on military radar during that time and that its last recorded position was 200 miles northwest of Penang Island in the Andaman Sea. This information combined with the pinging information from the Inmarsat satellite was enough to give officials a likely path the flight took until contact was no longer established. Based on all that, here's the path officials believe Flight 370 took from takeoff to final communication. It left Kuala Lumpur at 12:42 a.m. for Beijing. At around 1:07, the satellite lost communication with the aircraft. At some point between 1:19 and 1:21, the aircraft changed course and began heading southwest. At around 2 a.m., it passed the city of Georgetown on Penang Island before deviating again, this time heading northwest. At 2:22 a.m., the aircraft flew outside of military radar, still heading northwest. At some point after this, the flight changed course again, this time heading southeast, towards Australia. It's at this point that we can only rely on the hourly handshakes the aircraft made with the Inmarsat satellite network. The hourly pings indicate the path was somewhere along this line. The later pings allow us to narrow down the flight path to this area. The final ping at 8:11 indicates the aircraft was somewhere around this area at that time. The emergency generator clicked on at 8:19, indicated by an attempted login by the computer, probably because the plane's electronics lost power. By this point, the plane's fuel tanks were probably near empty. The inevitable crash into the ocean wasn't far off. Thanks to modern aircraft simulators, we actually have a pretty accurate recreation of what it would have been like to be in the cockpit during the flight's final moments in the air. This recreation may be disturbing to some viewers.
Left engine shut down.
2 years ago, in a 777 simulator, a plane he used to fly, the former Emirates captain put us into a death dive.
570 knots, that's about 1,000 kilometres an hour. This is going to hurt.
The plane's design meant it would corkscrew, increasing speed until it plunged into the ocean.
So you can see the sea coming up. Oh, I hate the visuals.
That's it. So that's a big crash.
Horrendous.
That's a big
You
crash.
would have exploded into millions of bits.
What makes Malaysia Flight 370 so fascinating is the mystery of who did this and why it happened. From our perspective outside the flight, there was no evidence of a hijacking. Although it's still a possibility, there's just no evidence to support that. One of the first steps investigators took was to identify the passengers and crew in an effort to shed some light on the entire incident. It didn't take long for investigators to discover that 2 of the passengers actually used fake IDs when boarding the flight. This was something that the news organizations really emphasized early on, but the story behind that was that there were two Iranians named Pouria Noor Mohammed and Syed Mohammed Reza Delawar. I apologize if I butchered those names, but the reason these two Iranians were traveling with fake passports was because they were actually seeking asylum outside of Iran. And it's not uncommon for people like that, from countries like Iran, to use fake passports to escape an exile. Neither of these two passengers had a criminal record or a violent history, and neither apparently had any ties whatsoever to any terrorist group. It was just a coincidence that they were on this flight. None of the other passengers stood out to investigators, which led them to really look at the crew members. The co-pilot was 27-year-old First Officer Farig Abdul Hamid. Hamid had joined Malaysia Airlines in 2007 and in 2010 was promoted to First Officer of the Boeing 737-400. In 2012, he transitioned to the Airbus A330-300. In November of 2013, he began training with the Boeing 777-200, and Flight 370 was supposed to be his final training flight. Hamid had over 2,700 hours of flight experience under his belt. The pilot in command was 53-year-old Captain Zahari Hamad Shah. He had been with Malaysia Airlines since 1981 and had over 18,000 hours of flight experience. Despite the co-pilot still being in training, these were not rookies manning the plane. While Shah had no criminal record or violent background, he became a focal point for investigators for several reasons. Shah had a YouTube channel with only 5 videos that were mainly about fixing air conditioning units. As of the release of this film, his channel was still up. His YouTube channel didn't really give investigators any real clues to go on, but 2 other facts definitely raised some questions. 1, Shah at the time was going through a divorce. This had been a marriage that produced 3 children, and having been through a divorce and child custody situation myself, I can personally tell you it's probably one of the most stressful things any person can do. Shah was also politically active in his community. He was a big supporter of Anwar Ibrahim's People's Justice Party. Myself being from the United States, I knew literally nothing about who this leader was or what his party stood for, which also I think makes for a great independent perspective of the case, since I'm not politically motivated. I could care less about his politics, but the fact that he was involved in Malaysian politics can be a motive for doing something you wouldn't normally do. Some outlets even refer to Shah as a fanatical supporter of that party. During my research, I think it would be hard to classify him either way. It's hard to gauge just how into the political scene he was there. I think anytime a politician or leader is brought up in a situation like this, it becomes bait in the media to either link it when there's no link, or wash away a link when there is one. So finding reliable sources about this can be hard, but I can assure you, I quadruple checked everything about this side that I'm discussing right now. And I'm probably the most unbiased person who's discussing the political side of this case. But Anwar was an opposition leader at the time in Malaysia. The party that he opposed was the United Malays National Organization. The UMNO, as they are also known as, had been in power for over 50 years at that time. The opposition that Anwar led was actually a coalition of several political parties there in Malaysia. In 2008, Anwar and his allies won more than a third of the seats in the Malaysian parliament, marking the first time since the UMNO came to power that they didn't hold a supermajority of the parliament. Not holding the supermajority prevented the Prime Minister from just changing the constitution at his discretion. Anwar was reportedly a political prisoner for 6 years there in Malaysia prior to that 2008 election. It was an election that also allowed his party to capture 5 of Malaysia's 13 state governments. So, is there a connection between this political party in Malaysia and Captain Shah? Possibly. On March 7th, just hours before Flight 370 disappeared in the early morning of March 8th, Anwar had been sentenced to 5 years in jail after a Malaysian court overturned his acquittal on sodomy charges. Whether these charges against Anwar are true is irrelevant, but the fact this event happened hours before Flight 370 makes for an interesting possible connection. There are some reports that Shaw actually attended the court hearing prior to taking flight that night. But there's another interesting thing about Captain Zaharie Ahmad Shaw. After Flight 370's disappearance, investigators searched Shaw's home, where they found what they called a sophisticated flight simulator. Looking at Shaw's setup in his home, his simulator wasn't anything out of the ordinary, and in all seriousness isn't incriminating alone, especially for a professional pilot like that. I mean, yes, it was a nice setup, but it's not that different from many of the people on YouTube who are also professional pilots and host a YouTube channel. But what is incriminating was what was found on his computer's hard drive. Those findings actually implicate Shaw more than anything else discussed here today. His hard drive contains saved simulator files for Microsoft Flight Simulator X. Here's a screenshot of where those coordinates were on his simulator. And here's a screenshot of the flight path that we believe Flight 370 took. When it comes to building my own conclusion, it takes a lot more than just rumors and conspiracy theories. It takes hard evidence and facts. One of the things they emphasize in digital forensics is to always follow the facts. It's not about what you know, it's about what you can prove. These findings on Shaw's hard drive have been a pretty convincing piece of evidence that he not only planned to divert the plane in advance, but that he actually practiced the entire thing at home. Based on how the plane was diverted and the misdirection air traffic controllers experienced during that evening, the one thing he may not have accounted for were the hourly handshakes between the plane and the Inmarsat satellite network. Without those, we probably wouldn't even be able to come close to figuring out the final flight path of Flight 370. But believe it or not, there were some very recent developments in regards to discovering what could be the aircraft's final resting place. And as accurate as we hope investigators have been with determining the flight's path, the crash site might just be a whisper away instead. The Weak Signal Propagation Reporter Network, also known as WHISPER, is an open source software program designed to send and receive low-power transmissions for testing propagation paths on MF and HF band frequencies. This technology, used for the most basic of radio waves, may be the key to actually locating the crash site of Flight 370. The reason WHISPER is even being mentioned here is because in May of 2021, an aerospace engineer named Richard Godfrey proposed examining WHISPER signals from the time Flight 370 went missing. It's believed the impact of the crash would have been detected with equipment used to monitor these radio waves. On December 31, 2021, a report was released detailing how WHISPER technology has been used to possibly locate the crash site by examining data from that time period. Out of a database of over 76,000 WHISPER links, 45 different instances recorded anomalies that all intersected at a single location: 33.2 degrees south, 95.3 degrees east. While this location is close to where authorities had been searching, this specific location provided by using WHISPER would definitely shed some light on where the flight's black box is. But it's not necessarily the possible location of the crash site that intrigued a lot more interest in the case. According to the WHISPER data collected, it appears that Flight 370 may have deviated course near the time of the crash. The data provided by WHISPER suggests Flight 370 deviated course 150 nautical miles off the coast of the western Indonesian island of Sumatra. Now, the source of some of this information is a little sketchy for my standards, so I'm slightly skeptical of its accuracy. However, if it is accurate and the WHISPER data did, in fact, determine that Flight 370 had actually flown in circles for 22 minutes, that raises a number of questions. Does this mean whoever was controlling the plane was still in control? Was someone able to make contact with someone on the flight? Did a passenger or crew member try to take back control of the plane? The original consensus of the hijacking was that whoever it was, a passenger, a crew member, or one of the pilots, that whoever did it could have adjusted the cabin pressure, forcing everyone without an oxygen mask to essentially pass out. But we just don't know exactly what happened inside that cabin. But even where one problem may get resolved, another emerges. Let's pretend this Whisper technology has discovered the exact location of the crash. That means we can send some divers down to search and retrieve the missing black box, right? Not exactly. This location marks a spot in the Indian Ocean that is 4,000 meters deep. That's roughly over 13,000 feet. The deepest any manned divers have ever dived is 332 meters, or a little over 1,000 feet. Now, it's true that submersibles have reached depths of over 10,000 meters, or 35,000 feet, but actually extracting the black box would still be incredibly challenging, and that's assuming we even knew the precise location. The disappearance of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 is arguably one of the greatest mysteries in aviation history, and even if more evidence of its location surfaces, we still don't know why or exactly who did all this. Since Flight 370's disappearance, new standards are being introduced to more accurately track any flight's exact location. But all the new standards in the world can't bring back the 239 individuals who have presumably lost their lives. I hate ending any of my films without some sort of closure, but in this case, this is the closest we can get. The disappearance of Flight 370 was a tragic event that has affected hundreds of families across the world. Hopefully those families can get some closure for themselves in the coming years.